In the year 1509, a 17-year-old boy with golden curls and fire in his blood ascended the throne of England. His name was Henry Tudor, and he would soon become known to the world as Henry VIII, the most dangerous lover England ever endured. He was not yet the swollen tyrant of later portraits, nor the widower of queens, nor the founder of a national religion created on the back of lust and revenge. He was just a boy with a crown too heavy for his brow, and a hunger not just for food, but for immortality, for power, and for a place in every history book written after the smoke of his rule cleared. From the very start, he lived too loudly. His feasts were too extravagant, his gestures too romantic, his rage too sudden, his apologies too rare, and his cruelty when it came was cold and precise, as sharp as the sword he would send for from Calais. They say power corrupts, but Henry never needed to be corrupted. He arrived already convinced that he was God's echo on earth, a king who bowed to no man and knelt only to kiss the hands of women until they disappointed him. And when they did, they bled. But before the blood, there were banquets. On his first Christmas as king, he spent over £7,000 in one night, not on war, not on Parliament, not even on his bride Catherine of Aragon, but on food: swan, peacock, roasted boar stuffed with gold-leafed apples. Minstrels played as mountains of sugar, sculptures collapsed under candlelight. Servants wore livery more expensive than a noble's estate, and dogs wandered through the halls wearing collars of crimson velvet embroidered with the king's arms in cloth of gold. His animals dined almost as richly as his court, and they slept beside the fire in chambers guarded by men with halberds. No creature close to Henry suffered until it was human. At the start, he was beloved. The common people cheered him in the streets. He walked among them in disguise, laughing, smiling, asking questions about himself without revealing his name. He liked hearing their opinions, but only when they adored him. He kept a mirror in his court, and every man who looked into it saw the king's face. He was obsessed with performance. His body was an instrument of spectacle. He jousted. He danced. He wrote music. He flirted and fenced and skated across the frozen Thames, while girls with flushed cheeks giggled behind fans. His court was a theatre, and he was both playwright and star. But that youthful charm cracked the moment someone refused to clap, and the first to refuse was the Pope. Henry's need for a male heir turned into obsession, and his wife Catherine, once adored, once cherished, once the mother of his stillborn children, became an obstacle. When she failed to give him a son, he sought her annulment. Rome said no. So Henry tore down 1,000 years of church authority in one stroke. In 1534, he signed the Act of Supremacy, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Just like that. He was not only king, but priest and prophet, pope and patriarch. He called it God's will, but it was a love letter to Anne Boleyn. He wrote her real ones too long. Aching letters, filled with promises of loyalty and passion, of casting off all other women for her, of being her servant in body and in soul. He drew hearts around his initials and enclosed them like a boy at school. She was clever, witty, sharp-eyed, and political, but she was not safe. Not in a palace built on male heirs and slippery truths. After 3 years of marriage, Anne gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, and then 2 miscarriages. The third loss was the one that damned her. Henry turned cold. His love faded like smoke in a drafty corridor, and when he no longer wanted her, he called for her death. In 1536, she was arrested for adultery, incest, and treason charges as fabricated as the smile he wore the morning he rode out hunting. Pretending nothing had happened, he sent for a swordsman from France to ensure the cut would be clean. It was his one gesture of mercy. She knelt in the tower, and forgave him with her final breath. She called him a gentle and merciful prince. The crowd did not cheer. They only watched. England had learned not to clap too loudly anymore. And yet, even as wives were beheaded, Henry still held feasts. Even as his waist expanded past 45 inches, and his legs ulcerated with wounds so foul that courtiers fainted from the smell. He still summoned minstrels. His weight grew with every failed marriage, every foreign war, every betrayal real or imagined. He had once been a prince of springtime. Now he was a god of rot. But his ego never thinned. He believed kings had no equals but God. And sometimes he believed even that was debatable. He wrestled Francis I of France at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520 and lost. Then, as if to erase the humiliation, he went to war again the following year. If he could not win with charm, he would drown the memory in blood. By the time Anne of Cleves arrived in 1540, Henry had aged into bitterness. He met her in disguise, hoping for love at first sight, and when she failed to recognize him, when she recoiled from his kiss, he declared her ugly, cursed the marriage, and had it annulled within 6 months. She was lucky. She lived. What makes Henry terrifying is not that he killed his wives. It is that he believed himself justified every time. His hunger for food, for love, for legacy could not be satisfied. He changed the church for a woman, then killed the woman. He surrounded himself with velvet-clad hounds and murdered queens. He laughed with the people, then taxed them for his dog's jewelry. He wrote poems about mercy, then signed execution warrants while listening to music. And England watched him, terrified and transfixed, knowing that to displease him was to disappear. This was not a king. This was a whirlwind in a crown. And his story is not over yet. There was a time, long before the ulcers, long before the thunder of cannons, long before the severed heads of wives and ministers rolled across the stones of the tower, when Henry VIII could have passed for a god sculpted in flesh. In his youth, his body was a marvel. He rode for hours, danced until dawn, hunted with an almost mythic precision, and performed in jousts with the flair of a man who never questioned his right to live forever. His calves were admired in every European court. His smile was once thought sincere, and his appetite for life, for women, for power was still manageable, still charming, still hidden beneath the gilded mask of a generous young monarch. But appetites grow, and masks crack, and no man, no matter how golden, escapes the gravity of his own hunger forever. Henry's descent began not with a betrayal, nor a war, nor a loss, but with a feast, or rather, 1,000 of them, in the great halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court, under the glint of candlelit chandeliers and the hum of lutes and pipes. Henry dined like a deity. A single Christmas in the year 1509 saw him spend over £7,000, an obscene fortune, on a single night's display of gluttony and grandeur. Peacock roasted with its feathers reattached, gilded with real gold leaf, marzipan castles, sugared fruits imported from the Levant, flowered like rivers, and all of it, every bite. Every indulgence was consumed not just by a man, but by a king trying to fill a void that would never close. At first, his body absorbed it all like firewood. He remained lean, vigorous, laughing through his courses, charming his ladies in waiting, and leaping onto his horse with the ease of a boy chasing wind. But as the years dragged him through ambition and failure, something began to shift. A jousting accident shattered his leg in 1536. The wound festered, never healing, oozing constantly. Physicians packed it with herbs, oils, and prayers. But the pain remained, and so did the swelling. No longer able to ride, to fence, to burn calories in the old ways. Henry's body ballooned. His waistline thickened with every year of war. Every wife he buried. Every minister he executed. He was once the handsomest prince in Christendom. Now he was a beast who needed to be hoisted onto his horse with a system of pulleys. And still he feasted. He consumed over 5,000 calories daily. Not for strength, not for need, but because he could, because no one dared stop him. Because he was the king. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson eats like that to maintain muscle. Henry ate like that to drown rage. And the kingdom paid for it. Lavish banquet meant lavish tax. Lavish tax meant discontent. And discontent, in Henry's ring, was treason. It was a slow spiral. One goblet of wine at a time. One slice of venison too many. One fur-lined robe added to a dog's wardrobe while commoners starved in the fields outside London. But the body was only half the collapse. The true fracture came when Henry looked across the table at his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and saw not a queen, but a failure. She had given him a daughter, Mary, but not a son. She had given him prayers, but not triumph. And worst of all, she had given him loyalty, but not obedience. When Henry decided to take Anne Boleyn as his new wife, he sought a divorce from the Pope. It was denied, and so, with the same calm he used to order another swan for supper, he destroyed the religious foundation of his country. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy named Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. The Pope was gone, Rome was severed, and Anne Boleyn, with her dark eyes and dangerous mind, stepped into the place of a queen. He told the world it was theology. He told his council it was divine revelation. But the truth was simpler. It was lust. It was obsession. It was a king who refused to hear no from God, from man, or from woman. He reshaped the church for her, and then reshaped the church again when he wanted her dead. It was not the sword that destroyed England's Catholic soul. It was the fork. It was the wine. It was the slow gluttony of a king who believed that divine right meant divine appetite. He feasted as his body collapsed. He preached as he lied. He prayed as he sinned. And all the while, the people bowed lower, spoke softer, and waited for the next axe to fall. And fall it did. Again, and again, and again. This is only the second chapter. The knives have not yet reached Thomas More. The tower door has not yet closed on Catherine Howard. Jane Seymour has not yet bled white to bring him a son. Anne of Cleves has not yet been kissed by a stranger and rejected her own husband. But already the pattern is set. Already the man who once danced through court has become the beast who lumbers through shadow, surrounded by velvet dogs and trembling courtiers. Already England has begun to dream of silence. And still he feasts. It was not her beauty that drew him in. It was not her status. For she had none. Anne Boleyn was not born to be a queen, not trained to wear a crown, and not raised to mother kings. What she did have was something far more dangerous, the power to say no. And to a man like Henry Tudor, a monarch who believed that even the Pope himself could be discarded like a soiled napkin, that quiet refusal was more intoxicating than any perfume, more provocative than any dress. When Anne declined to be his mistress, she became instead the architect of a reformation, and when she finally gave in, she became its first martyr. She came to court not as a seductress, but as a lady in waiting to Queen Catherine, slender, dark-haired, and sharp-tongued. She was not what men of the time would call classically beautiful. Her eyes were too knowing, her wit too fast, her presence too commanding. But Henry, who had grown bored with sweetness and grown tired of obedience, saw in her not just a woman, but a challenge, and the King of England did not lose challenges. He wrote to her by candlelight, sealing each parchment with trembling hope. He begged her for her heart, promised fidelity, promised power, promised everything short of heaven. She made him wait. She made him sweat. And then, one morning in a chamber, scented with orange blossoms and ambition, she whispered, "Yes, but yes had a cost. To marry Anne, Henry would have to destroy his first marriage. Catherine of Aragon had been with him for nearly 20 years. She had borne the deaths of their children with grace. She had offered no betrayal, nor scandal, nor shame. She had only one flaw. Her womb had not given England a son. And so, Henry called the union cursed. He called it blasphemy. He called it unlawful in God's eyes. And when Rome refused to let him cast her aside, he cast Rome aside instead. The entire kingdom trembled. Priests who had sworn to the Pope now had to swear to the king. Monasteries with centuries of holy relics were stripped bare. Their gold melted, their saints burned. The Church of England rose like a phoenix, but its feathers were ash, and its eyes were bloodshot. Those who resisted the change, like Sir Thomas More, were accused of treason, imprisoned, and eventually executed. England's Soul, once Catholic and ancient, now bore the image of a single man's desire. Anne had won, but the price was the prayers of a nation. Their wedding was quiet, secret, hurried. She was crowned queen in the year 1533, already heavy with child, and the court whispered of glory. A son, they said. Surely a son. But when the child arrived, it was a girl, Elizabeth. Tiny, red-faced, and unaware that her birth had just altered the course of history. Henry smiled through gritted teeth. Anne wept behind closed doors. But she promised him another chance. There would be more children, she said. Strong sons, glorious heirs. But her womb betrayed her. Again and again. The last miscarriage came in the winter of 1536. Some claimed it was a boy. Others said it was too soon to tell. It didn't matter. Henry was finished. The love that had restructured a kingdom curdled into resentment. Anne's sharp tongue, once alluring, now grated against his pride. Her confidence, once admired, now felt like defiance. And in a court where defiance could mean death, Anne was suddenly walking a scaffold with no handrail. The charges were absurd. Adultery, incest, plotting to kill the king. The men accused with her were courtiers, puts, even her own brother. Some had never even spoken with her privately. The evidence was whispers, glances, jealous gossip. But Henry did not need truth. He needed closure. He needed a clean break. He needed blood. The trial was a theatre of cruelty. Anne stood before men who had already decided her fate. She defended herself with grace, with dignity, with a calm that unnerved even her enemies. But it made no difference. She was sentenced to die. Henry, in one final gesture of what he considered mercy, sent for a swordsman from Calais, renowned for his precision, his speed. No axe, no hacking. One stroke, clean, elegant, efficient, like her removal from the king's heart. On the morning of her execution, Anne dressed in a gown of damask grey. Her hair was pinned beneath a simple coif. She walked to the scaffold without stumbling, without tears. Before the crowd, she spoke not of her innocence, but of the king's mercy. I am come hither, she said, not to accuse any man, but to pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. And then she knelt, and then the sword sang. Henry did not attend the execution. He rode off early that morning to hunt, and before the sun had set, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The kingdom burned for Anne Boleyn, not in fire, but in silence. The silence of priests forced to bless a death they knew was unjust. The silence of courtiers who had toasted her as queen and now looked away. The silence of a daughter Elizabeth, too young to know she had become the motherless symbol of an era born of love and drowned in ambition. Anne was never meant to be queen. She was meant to be the no that became a yes, the spark that became a church, the name that became a curse. And when she died, she did so with her eyes open, watching, remembering, knowing that kings fall too. Eventually, Henry would go on to marry again, and again, and again. But none of them not the pale Jane, not the German Anne, not the doomed Catherine Howard would ever change England the way Anne Boleyn did. She said no, and England burned. She never raised her voice. Jane Seymour was not a firebrand, nor a reformer, nor a woman who stormed courts or churches. She did not write letters in her own defence, nor speak too boldly at feasts, nor wear gowns that demanded attention. She understood something the others didn't. Henry didn't want another storm. He wanted a still pond, and so Jane offered him silence, deference, obedience, where Catherine had fought, and Anne had flirted. Jane merely bowed. She became the reflection. He craved a woman who would never outshine him, never contradict him, never demand anything he wasn't already prepared to give. And in return, she gave him the one thing neither of the others could. Asson. It was less than 24 hours after Anne Boleyn's head fell into the straw that Henry proposed marriage to Jane Seymour. The king's heart, if it could still be called that, beat on like a metronome, measured, cold, and moving swiftly to the next measure. The courtiers watched in stunned silence as the white-faced Jane stood beside the man who had just executed his wife for adultery. No love letters were sent this time. No reformations. No poetry. Just a contract. A ring. And the promise of quiet. Jane accepted. She always accepted. In the early days of their marriage, Henry doted on her with a weariness that felt almost like fear. Jane knew when to speak and when to disappear. She showed kindness to Princess Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and gently lobbied for her return to court. Henry allowed it, and the kingdom sighed with momentary relief. Here, perhaps, was a queen who could mend the broken seams. But Jane was no magician. Her strength was in stillness. And she remained still, even as the ghosts of Henry's past wives hovered over her shoulders, whispering warnings. Then, in the year 1537, Jane did what no wife had managed. She gave Henry a son. The labour was long. 3 days of agony, moaning through clenched teeth behind veils and candlelight, while the entire court held its breath. When Edward was born, Henry wept for the first time in years. He kissed Jane's hands. He knelt beside her bed. He told her she was the most perfect woman he had ever known. The Tudor line had its heir. The kingdom had its prince. The gods, it seemed, had finally relented. But the cost was waiting just around the corner. Less than 2 weeks later, Jane Seymour was dead. Childbed fever. Infection. Exhaustion. The physicians bled her, wrapped her in linen, offered tinctures and prayers. Nothing worked. Her breathing slowed. Her skin turned to wax. Henry stood by her bed, for once unable to command fate, and when she died, he did not marry again for years. Jane, the quiet queen, had given him everything, and disappeared before she could ever disappoint him. He buried her in white and gold. He called her his true wife. And decades later, when death finally claimed the king, who had consumed queens like wine, it was beside Jane that he chose to rest. In the crypt at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the king and the queen lie together. Still he, the thunder that shook England. She, the hush that briefly calmed the storm. But history did not pause for Jane. The court moved on. Henry's eye turned again to foreign alliances. His ministers whispered of politics, of German duchies, of new wives to cement power. One portrait caught his attention, a serene young woman with pale features and northern manners. Her name was Anne of Cleves, and her face had been painted by the famous Hans Holbein. The match was agreed. The treaty was signed. The bride was on her way. And then came the kiss. Henry, ever obsessed with surprise, met her in disguise. He believed, perhaps absurdly, that love might strike like lightning if only a woman could recognize her king in the face of a stranger. Anne, raised in a culture that did not trade in masks and theatrics, recoiled from the man who tried to embrace her without introduction. Henry was humiliated. The marriage was cursed before it even began. They went through with the ceremony. But Henry could not bring himself to consummate the union. He claimed she smelled, that her body was undesirable, that her appearance had been falsely advertised. Whether this was truth or merely the rage of a wounded ego, no one could say. But within months, the marriage was annulled. And here lies a strange grace. Unlike Catherine, unlike Anne of Cleves was allowed to live. She was granted a generous settlement, a palace, and the honorific of the king's beloved sister. She bowed, smiled, and vanished from the center stage of history, with her head still intact. But the palace corridors would not remain bloodless for long. In 1540, Catherine Howard, a teenager with the misfortune of beauty and the curse of being noticed, caught Henry's eye. She was everything. Anne of Cleves was not flirtatious, vibrant, foolish. Henry, now aging, bloated, and in constant pain, believed she loved him. He called her his rose without a thorn. He believed, once again, in the fantasy of youth and desire, and once again, he was wrong. Catherine had secrets, lovers before the king, rumors of trysts during their marriage. The court, always eager to whisper, provided enough evidence to call for inquiry. And when Henry learned the truth, or what he was told was truth, he collapsed into rage and despair. He wept. He screamed. He refused to eat. And then he signed the execution order. Catherine died young. Some say she asked for the block in her room the night before, to practice. Others say she wept for her life. What is known is this: she walked to her death in February of 1542, barely 20 years old, and knelt on the same ground where Anne Boleyn had once fallen. The executioner raised his axe, and Henry, once again, rode away. He had broken his fifth marriage, and England, by then, was broken with him. Next shall come Catherine Parr, the queen who read, who debated, who almost died for asking the wrong theological question in bed. But that is a tale for later. For now, remember this: Jane Seymour played along and was praised. Anne of Cleves misunderstood the game and lived. Catherine Howard never understood it at all and died. And the king kept eating, kept hunting, kept naming himself head of a church and master of women, whose names would outlive his mercy. The dawn was cold. Even for spring, a pale mist clung to the grass inside the tower walls, where no birds sang and no children played, and the stones remembered every cry ever spilled into their cracks. There, upon the green, a scaffold had been built not too high, not too grand, and not made for spectacle, but for precision. It was May of the year 1536, and Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, once the most envied woman in Christendom, stood upon it barefoot, slender, pale, and entirely alone. Her black eyes that had once seduced a king and sparked a war with God, looked calmly toward the sword. Not an axe, not the rough, dull blade of an English headsman, but a foreign sword, slender and curved, carried all the way from Calais for one final, élégant exécution. a gesture of mercy, a gift from a man who no longer loved her. But before there was the sword, there was laughter. And before there was laughter, there was love. Or something like it. Henry had not merely fallen for Anne, he had reshaped the world for her. Torn down cathedrals, rewritten scripture, cast away a Spanish queen and her child. For 7 years, he had waited for her, wrote her letters, branded with little hearts, promised fidelity, promised sons, promised crowns, and Anne had risen brilliantly, recklessly, as only a woman who knew her power ever could. She had danced at court with a wit sharper than any blade, refused to be his mistress, and forced him to bend the realm into a ring for her finger. And when the ring was on, the very ground beneath them began to crack. Their marriage was a collision, not a union. Anna had never been obedient. She interrupted ambassadors, debated bishops, dictated policy, and once told Henry to his face that queens were not cattle to be bred and discarded. But her womb betrayed her. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed by miscarriage after miscarriage. Then, in January of 1536, she miscarried a son, the child that might have saved her. Henry's gaze turned cold. He began speaking again with Jane Seymour, and the court, smelling blood, began to murmur. The charges came quickly. Adultery, incest, treason. 5 men were named. 1 was her brother. 1 was a court musician. 1 had simply looked at her too long. They were arrested, tortured, and dragged into sham trials. Anne, locked inside the tower, was given time to wait. She laughed. They said she laughed too much. Said she must be mad. They did not understand. Laughter was the only weapon she had left. And still, she hoped Henry might spare her. After all, he had once torn the world in half to hold her hand. He did not. Instead, he gave her a swordsman. The man arrived from Calais, a specialist, known for speed, silence, and the ability to end life in one clean movement. It was a gesture of mercy. Yes, but also control. Henry could no longer stomach the mess of an axe. He wanted her gone, but cleanly, neatly, with no screams, no blood on his hands, no twitching corpse. Anne, told of the sword, reportedly said, "I have heard he is very good, and I have but a little neck." She laughed again. The morning of her death, she dressed carefully. A grey gown, a crimson underskirt. She tucked her hair beneath a white coif. She walked from her chambers with dignity. No weeping, no hysteria. She climbed the scaffold and looked to the crowd, not for pity, but for witness. Her final words were strange. They praised the king. Our gentler, nor more merciful prince was there. Never. Whether it was fear or irony, no one could say. She knelt. She whispered her prayers. The sword flashed, and England changed again. With her death, Henry was free to marry Jane Seymour, who waited quietly, dressed in white, already prepared to be obedient and fruitful. Anne's belongings were seized, her servants scattered. Her body was placed in an arrow chest, for there was no coffin ready. She had once been the most powerful woman in England. Now she was a footnote, a warning, a rumour. But Anne Boleyn did not vanish. Her daughter, Elizabeth, lived on, watched, learned, remembered. Years later, when Elizabeth became queen, she would never marry, never kneel to any man, never forget the way power could twist into steel. She ruled with the shadow of her mother always behind her. Anne, the queen who laughed before the blade, the woman who said no and made a church fall. Henry, meanwhile, continued, He married Jane. He loved her. She gave him a son, and then died. And for the first time, Henry wore black longer than a few days. But even that mourning faded. Soon he would turn to Anne of Cleves, then to Catherine Howard, then to Catherine Parr. He would kill again. He would rage again. His leg would rot. His court would whisper, and his throne would tremble. But the sword from Calais had changed something. The people no longer believed in mercy. They had seen what love could become in Henry's hands. Anne Boleyn had danced too brightly, flown too high, challenged too much. And the king who believed himself the equal of God could not abide a woman who made him feel small. So he killed her, but not all at once. Slowly, with coldness, with silence, with a sword, not an axe, with distance, not fire. It is said that the ghosts of the tower still walk, that some nights, beneath a pale moon, a woman in grey can be seen standing on the grass, looking toward the chapel, waiting for something that never came. Not justice, not forgiveness, only the truth. He was not born to greatness. He had no noble crest, no blood of Plantagenet or Lancaster, no ancestral estate stretching across green counties. His father was a blacksmith. His uncle made shoes. His name, when it first passed through the corridors of power, sounded more like a servant than a statesman. But Thomas Cromwell would become something far more dangerous than a noble. He would become indispensable. And then, as all indispensable men did under Henry VIII, he would fall. Cromwell's genius was not in bloodlines, but in vision. He saw the cracks in the kingdom's foundation before the nobles did. He understood that England was not held together by banners or blessings, but by bureaucracy, by ink, by law. He had travelled through Europe as a young man, fought in Italy, learned languages, studied trade. When he returned, he attached himself to Cardinal Wolsey, the king's once trusted minister, and when Wolsey fell disgraced for failing to secure Henry's divorce from Catherine Cromwell, did not tumble with him. He stepped over the body and offered Henry something no other man could: a solution. The church. That was the key. Tear it down. Rebuild it. Put the king where the Pope once sat. Cromwell did not believe in sentiment. He believed in strategy. And Henry, nursing his fury, grieving his lack of sons, craving Anne Boleyn's touch, saw in Cromwell the perfect tool. With his guidance, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy in the year 1534. The monasteries fell. Gold flooded the crown's coffers. Opponents were silenced. Thomas More, who once dined with Cromwell, was now dead by his advice. Priests recanted their oaths. The king smiled. Cromwell rose. He became Earl of Essex, Master of the Jewels, Vicegerent of Spiritual Affairs. His fingers touched every chamber of the realm: finance, diplomacy, theology, punishment. He could name bishops and burn heretics, arrest dukes and rewrite laws, confiscate land and redistribute it in the king's name. And all the while, he bowed. He kept his voice soft. He never presumed. But every nobleman knew, if Thomas Cromwell looked at you too long, you might be gone by morning. But the court never sleeps. And envy, like rot, spreads from the shadows. Cromwell had enemies. The old blood Norfolk, Suffolk, Gardiner. They despised this commoner who whispered in the king's ear. They called him a malleable shadow, a merchant's clerk pretending at sovereignty, and they waited, patiently, because in Henry's court, time always killed. And then Cromwell gave them his greatest mistake. In the year 1539, Henry was unmarried again. Jane Seymour was dead. His son, Edward, was a fragile child. The realm needed a queen, a foreign alliance. Cromwell arranged a match with Anne of Cleves, a Protestant German noblewoman painted beautifully by Holbein. The portrait glowed. The treaty was signed. The bride was shipped across the Channel, and Henry, aching for youth and validation, rode to meet her in disguise. As he had once done for Anne Boleyn, he entered her chamber. Heart pounding, expecting romance. She did not recognize him. She recoiled at the kiss. She spoke no English. She laughed nervously, called him Sir. Not Majesté. Henry's pride collapsed. The marriage proceeded under political pressure, but Henry could not bear it. He claimed Anne was repulsive, that she smelled, that her breasts sagged, that he could not do his marital duty. And in private, he blamed one man for his humiliation, Thomas Cromwell. The nobles rejoiced. They circled like wolves. Cromwell, unaware or unwilling to believe it, continued his work. He was named Earl in April. He was arrested in June. The charge was treason. There was no trial, no evidence, just a letter from the king, delivered by armed men, stating that the man who had once built an empire in ink would now be destroyed in silence. Cromwell begged. He wrote to Henry from the Tower, "Most gracious prince, I cry for mercy." He pleaded, "For I am a poor man." He reminded Henry of all he had done, of all the gold he had delivered, of the church he had sculpted in the king's image. He offered names, confessions, loyalty. Henry did not answer. On the 28th of July, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led to the scaffold. The axe was dull. It took more than one blow. His head, still blinking, was held aloft before a crowd that neither cheered nor wept. He had been too feared to be loved, too useful to be mourned, and as his blood soaked the straw, the man who had reshaped England from behind a desk became just another ghost in the Tower. That same day, Henry married Catherine Howard. He danced at the wedding while Cromwell's body cooled. And yet, even in death, Cromwell's legacy lived. The bureaucratic machine he built, the system of councils, the royal supremacy, the machinery of fear remained. He had not been the king, but for years he had made the king's will into law, and he had died for delivering the wrong bride. A blacksmith's son had become the second most powerful man in England. And then he was nothing. In Henry's court, that was always the way. The Tower had heard it all before. Prayers whispered through cracked lips, promises scribbled on parchment by trembling hands. The rhythm of pacing footsteps and the silence of those who had stopped walking altogether. But this time, in the cold of autumn in the year 1541, the stones seemed to listen more closely, for in one of its upper rooms, behind an iron-banded door, a girl barely beyond her childhood sat at a small table, quill in hand, and tried to explain her life to the man who would soon end it. Catherine Howard was not made for the crown. She was made for music, for laughter, for soft fabrics and summer gardens. She was not born to be queen. She was born to be forgotten, a cousin of Anne Boleyn, raised not in palaces but in a household where the line between tutor and lover blurred dangerously. Catherine had been passed from hand to hand like a trinket until she landed suddenly, foolishly into the arms of the king, and Henry, old now, swollen and sickly, saw in her a miracle. She was 17. He was nearly 50. She giggled when she walked. She danced as though the air itself adored her. She called him her rose. Airlian. Her only. He called her his rose without a thorn. And just like that, she was queen. But thorns grow where no one sees. She tried to play the part. She dressed in silks, learned the rituals, tried to remember which noble hated which, and what spoon to use at which course. But she was no scholar. No schemer. She was a child in a palace built on secrets. And the worst of them Her past was beginning to slip through the cracks. Servants whispered, former lovers, bitter and emboldened, began to talk. Names emerged. Francis Derham, Thomas Culpeper, one from before the crown, one from after. The investigation was swift. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, approached the king delicately. As one might approach a wounded lion, he handed Henry a note. It was said the king read it in private, and when he reached the end, he fell to the floor and sobbed, unable to breathe. And then he raged. The same hands that had once stroked her face now tore tapestries from the wall. The Queen had betrayed him. The court trembled. They had seen this before. Catherine was arrested, taken to Sion Abbey first, then to the Tower. There, surrounded by grey walls and the ghosts of queens who had died before her, she was given paper and ink. She wrote a letter to the king, not of denial, nor defence, but of despair. She admitted her sins before marriage, pleaded for mercy, begged him to remember her youth, her foolishness, her love for him. If ever it had been real, she signed her name carefully, as if the curve of each letter might buy her another day. Henry never replied. The day of her execution arrived cold and bright. She wore a black velvet gown, her long hair unbound, her hands clasped together so tightly they turned white. Some say she practiced laying her head on the block the night before, to keep from trembling. Some say she screamed. But when she walked onto the scaffold, she did not falter. She spoke only briefly, asking God for forgiveness and mercy upon the king. She laid her neck upon the block. The axe fell. She was not yet 20. Her body was buried near Anne Boleyn's, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where the stones remember every injustice, but never speak of them. Henry did not attend. He rarely did. But he fell into a strange silence after her death. For months, he seemed hollowed out, drifting through his own court, like a man in mourning, not for Catherine perhaps, but for the illusion she had given him of youth, of love, of being wanted, not for his crown but in spite of it. And all the while, the Tower watched. It had seen queens rise and fall, seen ministers beheaded, seen boys imprisoned and never released. It was not cruel, only patient. And as it watched Henry grow older, more grotesque in both body and soul, it seemed to blink slower, as if waiting for him, too. But the king would not come yet. There was one more wife to name, one more woman to try and calm the storm, one more chapter before the end. The Tower held the letter Catherine wrote until her final day. No one knows what became of it. Some say it was burned. Others say it was buried with her. Still others whisper that it remains hidden in some dusty archive, waiting to be read again. A girl begging a god-king to remember she was human. The Tower never blinked. It simply listened, and when the axe fell, it closed its eyes for just one moment. She was not the most beautiful woman Henry had married. She did not dazzle courtiers with charm like Anne Boleyn, nor dance like Catherine Howard, nor bear the golden promise of youth. But she had something rarer, more dangerous, more enduring a mind that could survive a king. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, arrived at court already twice widowed, already intimate with death and decorum, already experienced enough to see the difference between being adored by a man and being owned by him. She was a scholar, a translator of scripture, a patron of learning, and perhaps, most miraculously, a woman who would live through Henry Tudor and leave the Tower behind her. She did not marry for love. Not at first. Her heart belonged to Thomas Seymour, the charming, ambitious brother of Jane. But when the King of England placed his hand over hers and asked for her loyalty, Catherine understood the weight of the question. She said yes, not because she wanted the crown, but because she feared what might happen to her and to her family if she said no. And so, in July of the year 1543, the aging king with rotting legs and a heart long calcified took another bride at court. Whispers began again. Henry was grotesque now, monstrously fat, unable to walk, unaided, his ulcered leg leaking through layers of cloth. He moved with difficulty, breath wheezing, rage always simmering just beneath the surface. But Catherine managed him. She spoke to him with care, never challenging him in public, never contradicting him without wrapping her disagreement in the gentlest silk. She gave him comfort, stability, conversation. She healed the wounds he did not show: his loneliness, his suspicion, his need to be feared, but also needed. She also helped heal his fractured family. Catherine played the role of stepmother with surprising warmth. She brought Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth back into court life, encouraged their education, gave them a place at the royal table. She guided the young Prince Edward with gentleness and grace. For the first time in years, there was something resembling peace within the royal household. And beneath that surface calm, Catherine wrote. She published religious texts, translated the Psalms, composed prayers that were read across the realm. She believed in reform not just of religion, but of women's minds. But even she made one mistake. One night, as the king lay in bed, bloated and breathless, Catherine began to speak of matters of theology. She questioned the interpretation of certain scriptures, discussed salvation, the authority of priests, the nature of grace. Henry's expression darkened. He said nothing. But in the morning, an arrest warrant was drawn. She was to be taken to the Tower, whether it was fear or instinct. Catherine acted swiftly. She threw herself at Henry's feet and wept, claimed she had only ever spoken to amuse him, that she, a mere woman, could never presume to know more than he did, that her questions were only meant to distract him from his pain. She played the fool. Just convincingly enough, Henry tore up the warrant. When the men came for her the next day, the king laughed, told them she was already forgiven. But Catherine had seen the blade hovering above her neck, and she never forgot it. She remained queen for the next 4 years. She stayed quiet, and when, in the winter of 1547, Henry finally began to die, she did not try to stop it. She folded his sheets, sat beside him, whispered prayers. She did not cry. Henry's body was swollen and broken, his leg black with rot, his soul bloated with blood. His eyes were yellowed, his hands trembled. He had ruled for 37 years, buried 2 wives, executed 2 more, annulled another, watched one day in childbirth, killed friends and enemies alike, torn down the church, burned the monasteries, and named himself God's instrument on earth. And now, in a bed that smelled of decay and regret, he faced the one thing he could not outwit: time. He made no great confession, no last proclamation, no poetry, only a request that he be buried beside Jane Seymour. Not Catherine, not Anne, not any of the women who had changed him, only the one who gave him a son and died before she could ever displease him. When the breath finally left him, in January of the year 1547, the courtiers looked to each other. Some were relieved, some afraid, some wept. But Catherine Parr, standing in silence beside the bed, simply turned and walked away. She had survived. For the first time, a wife of Henry VIII would go on to live another life. Months later, she married Thomas Seymour, her old love. She lived in the countryside, laughed again, even conceived a child. But fate, always hungry, had not quite finished with her. She died in childbirth in 1548, buried far from London, far from the Tower, far from the ghosts of the court that nearly killed her. But when her coffin was opened centuries later, they found her with her hands still folded across her chest, as if even in death, she remained composed. As for Henry, he left behind a kingdom reshaped in his image. 3 children, each from a different mother, would rule in turn. The church bore his mark. The law bent in his name. The palaces whispered his crimes. Even as portraits of his youth still hung in golden frames. He never looked back. He never said he was sorry. He was gone. But the echoes of his reign would ring through England for centuries. And now the throne sits empty. For the lion has died. The courtiers whisper more freely. The tower grows quiet for the first time in decades. And the bells that once tolled for queens now toll for a king. It is January of the year 1547. And Henry VIII, son of Henry VII, father to 3 monarchs, breaker of a church, devourer of wives, commander of armies, builder of palaces and prisons alike, has breathed his last. But England cannot sleep. Not yet. Not after him. They say that in death, a man is remembered not for the titles he wore or the gold he held, but for the people who whispered his name when he was gone. And if that is true, then Henry is not a man remembered. He is a man argued over, feared, mythologized, a man blurred by blood and legend. Was he the boy who danced in velvet and composed love songs, or the tyrant who signed execution orders before dinner and kissed the hands of new brides before the old ones were cold? Was he the father who cried at Edward's birth, or the tyrant, monster who sent his daughters' mothers to the scaffold? The truth, as always, is quieter and stranger. He was all of it, and none of it. He was 17 when he became king. He was already shaped by fear. His father had won the crown with blood, not birthright. Henry was meant to hold it with strength. But strength twisted into suspicion. Suspicion curdled into cruelty. And cruelty became law. He believed kings had no equal but God, and so he removed God from the throne and sat there himself. He married 6 women, but perhaps he loved none of them, or perhaps he loved them all. For a moment, until they became too real. Catherine of Aragon, the loyal lioness, cast aside like dust. Anne Boleyn, the spark who burned too bright, and whose laughter haunts the tower still. Jane Seymour, the calm in the storm, gone too soon to be hated. Anne of Cleves, the mirror that cracked the king's pride but lived to tell the tale. Catherine Howard, the child who died because she was not careful. Catherine Parr, the survivor, who held his hand at the end, and did not flinch. Each one a chapter, each one a mirror, each one a line in a song England would hum for centuries. And beyond the queens, the men, Thomas More, who died for conscience, Thomas Cromwell, who built the house and was buried beneath it, Wolsey, who rose too high, Cranmer, who trembled but endured, and the children Mary, Elizabeth, Edward, born from separate women, raised in separate beliefs, destined to reign in separate flames. The Church of England stands because Henry willed it, but not because he was holy, because he was human, desperate, proud, aching to bend the world, to match the curve of his desires. When Rome said no, he tore Rome out. When a queen said no, he cut her out. When a friend said no, he burned them out. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply changed the world and expected it to keep pace. But power has a price. Always. By the end, he was a ghost in a palace of flesh. His leg rotted so badly that the stench cleared hallways before he entered them. His courtiers learned not to breathe too deeply. He no longer danced, no longer rode. His bed was hoisted with ropes. His body so large that his armor could no longer contain him. He yelled more, laughed less, and England tiptoed through his halls, praying not to be seen, And yet, in portrait, he remains glorious. The great spread stance, the wide face, the tiny eyes lost beneath the crown. He looks out at us, not as he was in death, but as he demanded to be seen immortal, immovable, magnificent. But look closer. You will not find God there. You will find a man who never learned to lose, and still the country he ruled remembers him. In pageants, in plays, in textbooks, in museums, his wives are listed in nursery rhymes: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, but the rhyme forgets the heartbeats, the screams, the tears on parchment, the heads in baskets. The rhyme forgets the cost. Tonight, as England sleeps, the echo of his reign remains. The cathedrals bear his stamp. The crown he wore still passes from head to head. But no king since has dared to change the world as Henry did. No king since has tried to become God. So what? Then was he a monster, a visionary, a murderer, a father, a fool? Perhaps he was simply a mirror, one that reflected not only the darkest urges of power, but the deepest fears of every man who wears a crown. The fear of legacy, of sons who die, of wives who fail, of God who waits. Henry silenced them all. But in the silence, the truth remained. He did not want love. He wanted obedience. He did not seek redemption, only memory. And now, centuries later, we remember, and that, in the end, was all he ever truly wanted. Sleep now. Henry, the kingdom you made is still trying to wake up.